Well, thank you for your patience. And likewise, blessed feast of the presentation of the Lord on Wednesday. Um, so yeah, I'm just going to read through and then comment for what it's worth on chapter 63, Super-Correctness. There are some things that I'm not going to comment on. Probably doctrinal issues that are theologumena, that is not dogma, but rather the way that Father Seraphim approaches theology in controversial topics, which I think is very instructive. So that's what I'm going to spend time on, rather than maybe some of the theological minutiae. So I did put a link, I believe. If I didn't, it should. I think there's a link to the text if you want to follow along below in the description. If I didn't, you can go to orthodoxinfo.com, orthodoxinfo.com, and search for Father Seraphim Rose and look for chapter 63, Super-Correctness, and the text should be there. Good. All right, so here we are. Page 518. Super-Correctness. Quote-unquote traditionalism is not the same thing as the real traditional outlook. René Guénon, who was a big influence on Father Seraphim prior to becoming Orthodox. Fanaticism hinders a man's understanding, but true faith gives it freedom. St. Macarius of Optina. Of all the modern philosophies which Alexei Young, as a school teacher and later as a principal, was confronted with, perhaps the most powerful was that of evolution. He could see that most parents were ignorant of the very formidable scientific evidence against evolution, and also of the fact that evolution was being used, often quite deliberately, to undermine the very foundations of the Christian worldview. He decided to write an article for the sake of these parents, to make them more aware of what their children were being fed intellectually. Sending it to Father Seraphim for review, he received it back with a few suggestions and encouragement to print it in Nicodemus, which is a missionary newsletter. Sometime thereafter, Fathers Herman and Seraphim were surprised to receive a letter expressing displeasure over the article written by a priest of the Russian Church abroad who was under the spiritual direction of Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Boston, which, by the way, is very, very far now from any canonical relationship. So at the time, 40, 50 years ago, I guess, anyway, it was a complicated situation, but they were closer at least, but now they're not in communion with most of the Orthodox Church. So just by way of mentioning that, they do nice publications, but unfortunately that's probably about it. According to the fathers of the Boston Monastery, evolution was a forbidden subject, and it hurt this priest to see that Alexei was not agreeing with these authorities. Amazed to read in Nicodemus an article against such an established quote-unquote fact as evolution, the priest wrote that Alexei, as a convert who had retained his quote-unquote Roman perspective, should not be allowed the quote-unquote privilege of publication, and he stated that he was withdrawing all support from Nicodemus. So this is interesting. This is obviously long before the dawn of the internet, at least the public facing internet. And well, While working on the kingdom of man and the kingdom of God, Father Seraphim had made an investigation into the social, philosophical, and spiritual roots of evolutionism. Later, when attending the theological courses instituted by Archbishop John, he had studied the teaching of the Orthodox Church regarding the creation of the universe, as passed on through the scriptures and the writings of the Holy Fathers. And there's a note. His instructor at that time had been Father Leonid Obshinsky, who had taught classes on the first few chapters of Genesis according to patristic commentaries. Thus, having understood for a long time that evolutionism was antithetical to the Orthodox worldview, he concluded that the Orthodox critics of Alexi's article were, quote, just not aware of the whole issue of evolution, whether in its scientific side or in its religious theological implications. To Alexei Young, Father Seraphim wrote, obviously your article has touched something very deep. Frankly, we are astonished that people so keen on ecclesiastical matters, ecumenism, etc., should seem never to have given much thought to such an important thing as evolution. Apparently it is because it seems to be outside of the church sphere. Father Seraphim counseled Alexei not to consider his critics so much in error as simply unaware. He said he should not argue at all, but that together they should, quote, prepare a more thorough presentation of the whole subject. Your article, he wrote, beyond any doubt is going to make you unpopular in places. Do not let this discourage you or force you into a defensive posture. So that's one point that I think is worth coming back to. Father Seraphim's response to what he considered an erroneous approach to a theological issue was to think the best of the people that held contrary opinions, that they were not in error so much as simply unaware. And he also said that he should not argue, but instead just present the truth. So I think that that counsel against arguing is not by chance, and something that is probably quite important when trying to keep peace in the church and have dialogue in a spirit of love and hope for reconciliation rather than creating greater divisions. But there was more to come. Alexei wanted to print an article he had been given on the Shroud of Turin. When he sent it to Father Seraphim to check, Father Seraphim wrote back, suggesting that it not be printed in its present form since it was full of Roman Catholic expressions, which would immediately close the minds of some Orthodox. Unfortunately, this reply came too late. Before Alexei could communicate Father Seraphim's objections to the author of the article, the latter had the article printed and sent it out to everyone on the mailing list of Nicodemus. When I discovered this, I was distraught, Alexei noted later, for Father Seraphim's objections were good and thoughtful ones, and could have been incorporated into the article without difficulty. The Shroud article made Alexei's critics even more convinced that he was an unrepentant Catholic. As Father Seraphim recalled, we sent two long letters to Father Blank in defense of Alexei while admitting his mistake, and begging him to apply Vladika John's principle of trusting and encouraging missionary labors and not trying to make them fit into a preconceived pattern or forcing them to submit to some standard authority. To our grief, Father Blank replied that on this point, Vladika John was wrong, and converts must at times be, quote unquote, stomped on. So Yeah. Father Seraphim had noticed other signs of this same mentality. We were frankly horrified, he wrote, when we heard that Father Blank had suggested a year or so ago that Vladika Vitali of Canada be somehow placed in charge of converts or convert priests to avoid the mistakes of the past. Well, yes, that might mean the end of the mistakes of the past, but somehow we doubt even that. But it would also mean the end of the Orthodox missionary movement in the church abroad, period. And it wouldn't help to have someone better in charge. The principle itself is the dangerous thing. Alexei soon received a 21-page open letter from the Boston monastery against the articles that he printed. Its author, wrote Father Seraphim to Alexei, has obviously taken unfair advantage of you in order thoroughly to discredit you, based on the reputation of the monastery as against you, a nobody. He is writing on a current of intellectual fashion, and this will pass, and it will not be good for the good of the monastery that it has allowed itself to do this and not face the real intellectual problems of the day. Pray to Vladika John for guidance. Know that not everything depends on what some people think of you, and also that at a proper time, others will speak up for you. The open letter was published in a newsletter and sent all over the country. Years later, recalling this and other actions of the Boston monastery and its followers, Father Seraphim wrote, "The fact itself that they objected to the articles did not upset us. It was rather the way in which they objected. Through our extensive correspondence with them, it became clear that they believed that on such subjects it is not possible to have different opinions or interpretations of the Orthodox view. The Orthodox view must be one in favor of evolution and against the shroud. We had thought that Orthodox Christians could at least discuss these subjects together in a friendly way. But according to them, one cannot discuss these questions, but must accept the opinion of the quote-unquote Orthodox experts on them. And after this, they began to tell people to stay away from Etna because Alexei Young was just a Roman Catholic, and we know people who had followed this advice." Thus, our first cause to be upset with them was our discovery that they had formed a political party within our church. And those who do not agree with the quote-unquote party line are dismissed and regarded as non-existent, and people are even warned about the dangers of having contact with such ones. In the Russian tradition of long-suffering, we said little about this to anyone for a long time and did not have a similar feeling towards them, hoping that this was somehow a misunderstanding that would improve with time. So I'm afraid a lot of this has to do with some historical situations which are no longer valid, but the principle of openness and not creating political parties within the church, at least, is something I think that we can take away, and is something that is a danger, I think, in our current times of creating parties within a parish, one group that thinks that another group is wrong or bad, and especially when these things are related to non-theological matters. By 1973, Father Seraphim and Herman began to discover that not only had a political party been formed, but it also used political techniques to achieve its aims. For example, in 1972, one of the priests in the group suggested to Alexei Young that he merge his Nicodemus with their own newsletter, and that they would be happy to print the combined periodical to make it easier for Alexei. We thought this a very strange thing at the time, Father Seraphim recalled, and simply advised Alexei to continue his own independent publishing. Only later did we realize that by this means they intended to take over Nicodemus and ensure that it would never print anything not in accordance with the party line. Later, they told Andrew Bond in England that they would distribute his publication, The Old Calendarist, in America, but only on condition that no articles be printed without their censorship. In 1973, when we had asked them if they could help with the distribution of our proposed Russian language periodical, which we were never able to begin, they insisted that we let them print it also, and we began to realize that even our Russian language work was to be censored in Boston, and not even by Russian-speaking people, but by converts who had learned some Russian. Other political techniques include spreading the word that some particular publication or person is outside the party line. For example, after the publication of the Shroud article, Alexei received a number of letters from the group, all canceling their subscriptions to Nicodemus and offering, instead of the friendly criticism one would expect from fellow Orthodox Christians, a cold cutting him off. Alexei was so depressed and hurt by the treatment they gave him at that time that he would have given up printing altogether if we had not supported him, and told him that the attitude of other people in our church was not at all cold like that. Thus, on many occasions, the fathers received clear indications that the new party intended to make their party line prevail, at least over the convert wing of the Russian church abroad, and if possible over the Russians also. This whole attempt, Father Seraphim wrote, is so foreign to the Orthodox spirit that we have found it to be extremely distasteful and a kind of Jesuitism that has crept into our church. Father Seraphim noted how the new party had begun to practice the Jesuit principle of the end justifies the means. When I went to their conference in 1973, Father Seraphim recalled, one of their priests told me something that I did not fully appreciate then, but which I now see as a part of the problem which they have become for us. He told me that if one is working for a good church cause, it is permissible for one to lie, cheat, etc., for the sake of the good cause. Sadly, we've seen this Jesuit principle in operation among them in the way they spread tales about people who they do not like, misrepresent the position of people they wish to criticize, etc. At one point, the faction began quoting letters against Alexei, which the latter knew for certain he had never written. The fact that you are having quoted against you letters that don't exist, Father Seraphim advised Alexei, should make you sober and realize that against that kind of attack you can't fight, if you are an honest man. Therefore, don't. Let them do and say what they will. So, okay. Sometimes there are questions or something. No. Okay. What time is it? Let's go for a little bit longer. Let's see. I'm not sure how long this chapter is, but I don't think I'm going to go through the entire chapter. It's yeah. Just going to finish this page, and if there are any questions, I will address them. Otherwise, I'm just going to call it a night after that. Well, maybe not. Maybe I'll do a couple more pages. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm at the top of 522, if you're following along. More than anything else, it was the open letters coming from the faction that led the fathers to conclude that something had gone wrong. Beginning in 1973, these letters were directed to people within the Russian church abroad whom the party wished to criticize and correct, including its chief hierarch and several bishops. Almost without exception, Father Seraphim noted, these letters have made a bad impression on us. In most of their individual points, they are quote-unquote correct. But in their tone, they are filled with self-justification, subtle mockery of others, and a tone of cold superiority. So these letters made a bad impression on us. While they were quote-unquote correct, theoretically, The tone was filled with self-justification, subtle mockery of others, and a tone of cold superiority, which should be signs that there's something wrong with a situation if a group has this kind of attitude, especially in the church. Many of these letters were actually lengthy essays filled with long theological passages, which were at best only loosely related to the issues at hand. One young convert in England, on receiving such a letter about himself, was very disheartened. But Father Seraphim identified for him what was behind it. It was, he said, a cold and calculating vehicle for their self-esteem, behind a mask of absolutely fake humility and spirituality. The Russians would call it oily. Father Herman, who has a thoroughly Russian approach to such things, said after reading this letter, "The man who wrote this does not believe in God," which is to say, everything holy, spiritual, and canonical in it is used for some ulterior motive, and the letter is devoid of Orthodox heart and feeling. The letter itself does not deserve an answer. They are experts in using this tactic and would tear any reply of yours to shreds, knowing how to make it appear that whatever you say is wrong. Father Seraphim called the attitude that produced these letters being spiritual while looking in a mirror. He noticed that all the letters coming from people in the party breathed the same spirit, as if written by the same person, even though some of the writers we know personally to be not like that at all. Just recently, I came across some letters to us from Boston 12 years ago, and what a difference. They were just strugglers then, and too bogged down in daily labors to be writing such long-winded epistles. What has happened? So I'm going to read to the top of the next page, and then I'm going to call it a night. So, in order to have his own views prevail in the Russian church abroad, the new faction did not stop at open letters, but began to systematically undermine the authority of the most respected Orthodox teachers of recent centuries. Its chief weapon in this, noted Father Seraphim, is the recent academic fashion of looking everywhere for quote-unquote Western influence in our theological texts. Most of the recent teachers, from St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain down to Archbishop of Verki, were accused of being under this influence, of being scholastics. The theologians of the party were giving people to believe that they knew more about Orthodox theology than St. Nectarius of Pentapolis, St. John of Kronstadt, who talked about the quote-unquote merits of Christ, Archbishop John, St. John of Shanghai, who commissioned a service to be written to the Western Holy Father, Blessed Augustine, and the Optina elders. Such presumption, wrote Father Seraphim, can only do harm to the real cause of renewing Orthodox life by drawing from the fresh springs of Orthodox tradition. As Father Seraphim realized, the alarm over Western influence was based upon a half-truth. Father Michael Pomazansky, he wrote, and other good theologians, will readily admit that there were such Western influences in the theological texts of the latter period of the Russian and Greek history, but they also emphasize that these influences were external ones, which never touched the heart of Orthodox doctrine. To say otherwise is to admit that orthodoxy was lost, ! In these last centuries, and only now are young theologians finding again the orthodoxy of the fathers. If such theological giants as Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow, Bishop Theophan the Recluse, Bishop Ignatius Brian-Kananov, Archbishop Averki of Jordanville, Father Michael Pomazansky, and in general the theology taught in our seminaries for the last century and more, are not really orthodox at all, then we are in a very dangerous condition. And where are we to find our theological authority by which to stand firm against all the errors and temptations of these times? The theologians of the new party teach, we will teach you what is right. We will read the Holy Fathers for you and teach you the correct doctrine. We have excellent translators and interpreters who are more Orthodox than Bishop Theophan, Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow, Archbishop Averki, and all the rest. This is a terribly dangerous game that they are playing. They are unwittingly undermining the Orthodox ground under their feet. Father Seraphim believed that what these apparent traditionalists and zealots were doing was precisely what the so-called liberals of the Parisian school were doing, severing the link, cutting off the recent roots to the ancient fathers, in order that they themselves might be the authorities. The new theologians of the traditionalist school now claim that they had been able to sift through the scholastic additions to our theology and return to the faith of the fathers. This was the claim of the Parisian school also, as Father Seraphim wrote to one priest. This points you in the direction of a kind of Protestantism, by placing a gap in the Orthodox theological tradition, which only your group manages to span by skipping the interval of the quote-unquote Latin captivity and getting back to original sources. The very notion of Latin captivity is played up by Father Alexander Schmemann and his colleagues precisely with the aim of destroying the idea of the continuity of Orthodox tradition throughout the centuries. Do not fall into that trap. There are great theologians of the past several centuries who used expressions one might like to see improved, but that does not mean that they are in Latin captivity or should be discredited. They just do not use these expressions in the same context as the Latins, and therefore the issue is not a very important one. I think that's probably all I've got. And I haven't got too much to add to it. But that's okay, because the things that Father Seraphim Rose says kind of stand on their own. I forgot how historically based this section is. I think it's still relevant to our present time, as far as the spirit that one should see in Orthodox discourse, a spirit of love and respect, and not a spirit of judgment, condemnation, and belittling others, which unfortunately happens, and then justifying it somehow, as somehow trying to justify unchristian behavior, because it's supposedly saving the church or protecting the church. So that was what I found most helpful, I guess, as I was reading through it. But there was a question I'm going to answer. So there we go. And then I'm going to call it a night. Dr. Middleton, you worked to republish Two Paths by Michael Walton. Are there other books now in the works, and do you take requests for Orthodox books that should be back in print and readily available? I do take requests. I will certainly consider. If you want to mention them to me, you can reach out. If you go to the About page on the YouTube channel, there's an email there that you can use. As far as other works that are in the pipeline, there's a French translation of Michael Walton's book. A Romanian translation, God willing, will come out. I've got to work on my doctoral dissertation, which is kind of an Orthodox evaluation of certain aspects of the theology of C.S. Lewis. So that's it, really, which is more than enough to keep me busy for a while. Hello, Sarah Carnes. Welcome. I'm sorry we're about to close down for the evening, but glad you could be here. Hopefully there's something edifying. I will be doing this again, God willing, in about a month's time, last Monday of the month of February at 9 p.m. So blessed feast of the entrance of the Lord on Wednesday. And I pray this finds you all well. Yes. Yes. Well, come again. 9 o'clock next month. Take care. Good night.